Hey, Russ, Classic DM back with another video. This time we're going to talk about the classic Village of Hommlet module, which is the epitome of a starter module for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And I know a lot of you have played this over the years, so if you're coming back in time to revisit this module, you'll have a lot of fun with it. If you've never played it before, this is going to give you a really good insight into what the module is all about, some of the things to look out for, what is some of the tricks with some of the factions that are happening, how it connects to the Temple of Elemental Evil, the history behind it, publication dates, all kinds of interesting details that are related to the entire adventure. And if you know all those things, it'll allow you to adjust it to fit your party, because even though this module is, supposedly designed for level 1 through 3 characters in a modern world, if people are playing this like your kids or your family or something like that, and if they only have like 2 or 3 players, that's not going to be enough overall character power to survive a long haul, especially when you get to the moat house. Let's go ahead and just jump into some of the great details here. I'm going to give you an overview first, and then we'll come back to the actual module itself. So, when you go back in time to 1977 and 79, when they first started making modules at TSR for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, this was a campaign from Gary Gygax and the other TSR guys, and they talk about some of the heroic characters that they played that later on became signature characters in the Temple of Elemental Evil. One thing to note, though, is that, the Village of Hommlet was always kind of designed as this level 1 introductory party enters a small peaceful hamlet, where's all the secrets kind of a vibe, right? So that's 1979, right? So the Temple of Elemental Evil doesn't come out until 1985. It's like 6 years later, but in the actual text of the Village of Hommlet, and even on the cover, they're saying, hey, this is a lead-in module for the Temple of Elemental Evil. The Temple of Elemental Evil, which is Menser and Gygax working together, is like one of the most favorited dungeons because it's just so big and so long, and you can progress through the whole thing. It's multiple levels. It has a really great theme. There's a really cool history behind it. But the Village of Hommlet is not really set up for you to go play 1 or 2 sessions and go marching in the Temple of Elemental Evil. You get wiped. So let's talk about what's going on in Village of Hommlet. So if you do run it for your friends or your family, you have a sense of how many sessions you need to run it for, what some of the things you need to tweak, especially in the moat house, and some of the things happening in the actual village of the factions that'll be a little tricky. So before we go any further, break out your World of Greyhawk map and get a sense of where this stuff is. Now, if you don't have a copy of the original and haven't got another one off of DriveThruRPG and you want to get this, you could probably just go ahead and get the Temple of Elemental Evil like this, because it says T1 through T4, because it will include everything that's actually in the original Village of Hommlet. Now, unless you want to collect them all, which you could do too, and you can do these as print on demand, which I've done, and they look really great. They're like having brand new printed copies of these. Yeah, but if you want to save some money, you can get the Temple of Elemental Evil from DriveThruRPG or the Dungeon Masters Guild, and that will have everything exactly verbatim that's in the Village of Hommlet. But if you want to have it separate and you just want to run the Village of Hommlet, because you could be busy doing that for 3 or 4 weekends in a row, you'll find that there is a map that kind of gives you a sense of where in the World of Greyhawk this is, which is near this little city with this funny name called Verbombonk, right? And some of the nobles are mentioned a few times. They've been involved in some of the local economy. They've done some outposts. And there's a lot of history going way, way back to when the Temple of Elemental was actually overthrown and destroyed. So the time frame for the Temple of Elemental Evil and the Village of Hommlet is after all that's done. So we'll read some of the history to you as well, and you'll see how that works out. But if you look on the original map here, you can see Hommlet's these Cron Hills, and to the northeast is this kind of nasty village called Nulb. The Nulb stuff was really added inside the Temple of Elemental Evil campaign. It's not there in the Village of Hommlet. All it does is mention it and talk about it, but it's never part of the adventure. So if you start playing this, just stick to Hommlet and don't worry, and the moat house will be the climax or crescendo of the adventure. And this is only I think 10 miles away. So if you have a copy of the City State of the Invincible Overlord, or if you have another good city map campaign you want to do, that city is a great place. It's along a river. People could arrive by boat. That's a great, place to gear up and bring the adventurers here. In the original module, it kind of describes you as, broke nobodies with a busted horse and barely anything to your name. So that is really up to you. I recommend anytime you're playing adventure to never start at level 1, especially with new players. especially if you're using random hit dice. So someone's rolling up their hit points. I mean, you could have a magic user with 2 hit points. I mean, it's just so low and so fragile at such low levels that it would take a lot of smart group play to keep those low hit point characters alive. And even someone who is a fighter that happened to have 10 hit points at level 1, if they get swarmed by a few gnolls, they're just going to get destroyed. So it's better to have more fun with the longevity of the characters being a little higher level. I actually recommend levels 3 through 5 with a small party of 2 to 4 players playing 1 character each. If you have people that are brand new to the game, that also gives them a chance to have a little bit better armor class, a little bit more abilities, especially the casters and some of the heals and things like that. You might want to toss them 1 or 2 little fun magic items like a +1 longsword or a couple of potions of healing, something like that. Something that they can actually get out of jail free every now and then. Why is that? So, us hardcore folks who played this stuff when it first came out, we were kids, right? And we didn't know what we were doing. We're just having fun playing with 6 of our friends, in someone's front bedroom. And back then, there's 6 of us, so some of us are playing 2 characters. So we'd have a party of 12, and a new kid would show up one weekend and roll up a new character, and then we'd play for 3 weekends, and that kid would drop off, and another kid would come along, and we had to level them up. And so there was always a swarm of violent children to destroy everything, right? So it wasn't really a problem. But in the modern world, it's pretty rare to have, 6 or 7 people at your gaming table, if at all. You might just have 2 or 3 people. So make sure that if you're going to play this, and you've read through the whole thing and you get the themes, yes, that's great. All Dungeon Masters do that. Don't feel like you're violating some sacred truth by having the characters be like levels 3 through 5. I mean, obviously I wouldn't go 6 to 10, but 3 through 5 should work pretty well, especially if you play the game with hardcore or rules as written and don't use my house rules. Okay, so you have that location there. The moat house is somewhere that's kind of off to the northeast that we'll talk about in a few minutes. That's a local ruined castle that was once an outpost for the Temple of Elemental Evil itself, and it was also razed to the ground. It's relatively intact. A new boss has moved in down there, and it's got some cronies, and there's some humanoids and some undead. So that's a neat little dungeon adventure in the basement of it and at the ground level. But even at that, the first encounter is a bunch of giant frogs, and they'll wipe out a party of first-level kids. Won't be fun to do that. All right, so let's jump into some of the details here of the actual adventure that's really, really cool. I don't want to read this verbatim, but I do want to skim through it for you. In the beginning of the module, if you actually are flipping through it itself, if you just go here and you start flipping through, this first whole section here is the background. So it's worthwhile to read this because it tells you, the Dungeon Master, everything that went on, right? What happened in the past, what the history of the village is, when it was a collection of hovels and its card became more powerful, and then the evil influence of the Temple of Elemental Evil came along, and then they started raiding and all this history, right? So you need to kind of think about, okay, my party of adventurers are low attention span. They don't need all that information, right? You may just want to let them arrive at this village, and you may want to give them an objective, right? The objective may be something in the moat house. Maybe it's rescue someone, or you want to make it where when they arrive at the village, they encounter someone who wants to hire the party to go rescue a kid who's been kidnapped, or someone's daughter, or a bunch of stolen weapons, or something that gives the party a reason for being here. Because despite all the really interesting Greyhawk history here about the Elven Kingdom of Selene and all this kind of stuff, that's really great for us hardcore Greyhawk people who had multiple adventures happening in the world of Greyhawk. We kind of want to know like what the sit rep is in this area. But for a modern day group of maybe like teenage kids, or wives and daughters and things like that playing, or just best friends, it's going to be boring to them. Like they're not going to get it. Hearing about the great battle against the Temple Elemental that has nothing to do with the adventure at all, except for history, isn't going to keep their attention span. So what I always recommend you do is come up with a really simple plot device. Either it kicks off once the adventurers arrive in the village and start beefing around and exploring and bumping into people and going to the inn, or maybe the Church of St. Cuthbert. And then from that, kind of give them I hate to say it, but it's like a quest in Baldur's Gate, right? The Church of St. Cuthbert could be a great place to do it. When they meet the Druid of the Grove, that could be a great place to do it. When they go to the Inn of the Welcome Wench, that could be a good place to do it. But most D&D players start raising hell when they get into a bar and just like a Conan novel. So you may want to keep that in just rambunctious mode and let someone do the more serious stuff later on. There are some more details we want to cover related to that stuff before we go any further, because we're not going to play the adventure. We're just going to talk about some of these high level details you need to know, because we're going to play this in modern day, and we need to understand that some of the stuff from a long time ago slows things down and doesn't necessarily make it great for the players, but it may be great for you, right? So when they start talking about Null with the Temple Elemental Evil, that might be some history that some people know. You know, like you can't start having NPCs in the town talking about Null or talking about the Temple of Elemental Evil, because it sounds like you're teasing the players to go there, and that's not what you're going to be doing when you're running just this adventure, because it's a much longer, more high level, more. But you could talk about it if you have NPCs that are giving background of what's going on. Why was the Church of St. Cuthbert built here? They could drop some information about this history that happened a long time ago. So for you, this background information equips you with information you need to know to figure out how to make the present situation interesting. And if you do have knowledgeable NPCs, and there are a few of them in the village that are quite cool, they might have an opinion or talk about this, etc. And the current event right now is that isn't really a threat. The Temple of Elemental Evil was smashed down years ago in a fortnight. They had the aid of this terrible demon. The forces of Verbombant came down with an army, just wiped everything out, right? Shut it up and sealed it forever. But for this adventure, you don't want to get too much into the weeds of that. Okay, I think we kind of beat that down too much. So if you really do need to just start the adventure, and you have players that are used to playing D&D who kind of know what the game is, like how they know, like, hey, go here, explore, talk to people, see what happens, get into trouble, instead of just thieving and stealing everything all the time. This area I've highlighted in yellow is a good basic kind of description of what's going on ahead of you if you've never been there before. And you can always add on to it. The only thing about it that's a little tricky is it has a lot of these, like, will the outsiders be shunned? Are reports of the whole community evil, engaging in evil practices true? Those are seeds you may want to skip out of, because they sound like a blurb on the back of a book. They don't sound like something you would read to players when they arrive. So when you go down below, it starts talking about the dusty road and the closely grown hedges and the brambles and shrubs and the farmhouses. You're going to be able to paint that picture of this calm village that doesn't really look like anything bad's going on. And that's pretty much what you want to do if you're going to run this thing, because that's its tone and that's its theme, that this place is not a place with fires going off. The militia aren't fighting. There's no factions. The English aren't controlling the Scottish. There's none of that kind of business going on. It's just a basic, calm, simple little place. Okay, so as you start reading through the module, you're going to pick up all these elements in bold. And let's zoom this in a little bit so you can see it better, because it'd be too small otherwise in the video, right? Where you start having a description like, hey, modest farmhouse and a barn and clean but slightly run down buildings indicate this farm is not too prosperous, right? But when you read through it, in bold is where they put the Dungeon Master only information. Like for the example here, like this one guy is a 4th level ranger and he's pretending to be drunk all the time, and he's there to seek out what's going on, people coming to town, suss them out, etc. So that's the behind scenes information for you. So you may want to print this out and like circle these kind of guys and maybe make some notes that say, oh yes, this character is associated with this faction and this character here is associated with that faction. And then you'll be like, wait a minute, how many factions are there all together here? Well, there's like 6 or 7, right? Some of them are more important than others. So the major faction you're going to bump into with all the people that live in the different villages or run some of the businesses is it'll say, oh, this is part of the local militia, or this is the captain of the guard or the local militia. So for any little town like this, they might have demi-humans and orcs and gnolls attacking every now and then. They're going to have some kind of local militia to keep things under control. That's the most like peon-oriented type of faction, where most of the people are part of the militia, but they're not running around on guard duty up and down the street. Okay, they're working their normal lives. If things start to go wrong or something happens, or if the players cause trouble, they might be called to arms to come intervene. All right, the second major faction is the St. Cuthbert faction. Now, if you really want to do your homework well, you could pull over the Temple of Elemental Evil and go down to basically the back where there's an appendices for the deities and demigods. And in that section in the back, it talks about this guy, which I will not pronounce because his name is unpronounceable. I think people call him Uz. I always call him Ios, which is apparently wrong. But St. Cuthbert is back here. And, St. Cuthbert, his whole description is very Scottish, crack him over the head, kind of like, carry a big stick. He appears as a stout red-faced man with a drooping white mustache, flowing white hair, simple plate mail, +5 enchantment. He's got this beret on, a big cudgel in his hand. This bronzewood cudgel is St. Cuthbert's grass. This is like a deity. So you won't actually have, your players won't encounter this deity, but later on when they're in the adventure, they'll find that there's a whole church that's been built to this deity. And if you visit the church, there's a number of NPCs who are clerics of that church, and there's huge statues and things like that. So the players will actually physically be able to see and understand the themes and all that. So if you are running this for adventures and they go into this church, you know, you're not running like a Catholic church or something like that. You're running this Church of St. Cuthbert, which is going to have this kind of old European Scottish flair to it in a way. And you don't have to talk in a Scottish voice or anything, but if the more you understand about St. Cuthbert, that's why I recommend, if you have the Temple of Elemental Evil, you can research this behind the scenes, or you can search on the web. Now, they're not going to encounter this guy, but having the history of him would be interesting. There might be stained glass, there might be tapestries on the wall. The priest that you bump into might have something that he really wants you to be involved in that's thematically connected to St. Cuthbert. But there is a faction in the town that are followers of this religion, which is a kind of a goody two-shoes religion. The other faction that's there is pretty easy to spot on the actual village map. Let's go to our overall map here. You know, the original map is, you know, looks like this 55 years later, but if you clean it up some, it pretty much looks like this. And there's an area in the middle, hard to miss. It's called the, you know, this Grove of the Druid. And this is another major faction that's in this small little town. There's this druid that has a number of followers, and from there you'll be able to understand, you know, druids are always neutral, right? They're always like tree hugger type, animal kingdom, and he's got like a pet bear that's always hiding. There's all kinds of crazy stuff. There's lots of agents of the Druid of the Grove, and they're mostly about keeping an eye on things and making sure things don't get out of hand. And so if there's anyone that comes into the town that's got, you know, kind of evil ideas or something connected to the Temple of Elemental Evil, that druid that's there is kind of a custodian of what's happening in the village. And I think if you go through the module here, let's look at the map and find out where his location is. His location is 24. So if we actually go to about here, there it is, the Grove. So he's got like a cloak of protection, a +2 staff of the snake, and you have all this information, his spells and everything. But in these things, you know, Jaru is his name, they tell you, you know, what the person's purpose is here. Like, for example, you can going back to the Church of St. Cuthbert, it mentions this other heroic character which you encounter in the Temple of Elemental Evil called Yade or whatever. So there's a lot of interconnected threads between characters here and characters in the Temple of Elemental Evil that won't make any sense, that you may not want to reveal to the players until later, because they won't know who you're talking about. It'll just be a name. But it'd be pretty obvious that when you're playing this out with your friends and family, whoever you're playing with, that the Druid of the Grove seems to be kind of like the anchor point of what's going on in the community. And then you have the St. Cuthbert stuff happening as well. And then you have all the followers that there are a couple of families in the town that are kind of like outsiders and shunned. Taking care of that is not that hard to do. So those are the three major factions going on. Now, actually, we need to kind of mention these minor ones. There's a tower that's been constructed. There's 2 NPCs, Burn, who's a magic user, Rufus, a fighter, has a silly name. You know, these are like adventurers who built this massive tower. There's a brilliant series of maps for it. They have henchmen. They have all kinds of loot and treasure. They don't really meddle in the affairs of the town very much, but as you can see on the main map here, let me just highlight this for you. I mean, their tower is right here. It's right across the street from the stonemason. So they've intentionally built this, you know, circular tower up like you see in Ireland, as their base of operations for doing what it is they're going to do. So if the players do end up interacting with them and going to do things with them, that's another faction to deal with. And this little picture here is supposed to represent the 2 of them coming out of their tower. There's a whole key to the tower and everything about it and the multiple floors, and we'll look at some of those maps in a few minutes, and some of the John Pintar maps, which you got to have if you're going to run this. Another very minor faction is kind of like the distant influence of the Viscount and Archcleric of Voluna. And if you go back to your Greyhawk map, you know, Voluna is going to be way up north of here. And so they have had a financial influence in this area to start building a castle-like structure, which is mentioned as only being done in the early stages. And there's a lot of workers working on it. If you look at the original map, that's kind of dashed out right here, right next to the tower, owned by Burn and Rufus, right? So whether there's a connectivity there or not is up to you. Like, is Burn and Rufus working with the Count of Voluna and they're watching over this construction? There's even description for all the workers, you know, in hovels across the street in a work camp. So this is all under construction, and if you were actually really there, it'd be pretty interesting to go there and check it out. But there's really no plot points here. So there's nothing about the construction of this castle in the very early foundation phases that the players will just run out of things to do. It's a good opportunity for you to maybe utilize Byrne and Rufus as the overseers, and so the players start meddling around this area, you can have them walk up to them and say, hey, what are you doing here, and start talking to each other. Not necessarily confrontational, but that could be the connectivity between them, and the workers that are building the castle might speak of Byrne and Rufus with fear or things like that. So use your DM imagination to create some kind of relationship that the players might interpret, and it's a call to action for them to go do something about it. Or it could just be, hey, this is great, really cool, I'm glad they're building a castle, right? And so that's another major faction that's, the proximity is right there in the town. There's mentioned a couple of NPCs have connectivity to the elves of the Northwest, but you don't really need to worry about this because it's not like the Lord of the Rings or something where we're going to go traveling off to some Northwestern elven enclave and then run back and deliver letters or anything. But it is a couple of characters that are in here that are connected to them. And of course, as you've heard me say 500 times already, there are forces in the town that are associated with the Temple of Elemental Evil, which is trying to make a resurgence, and they're just kind of informants. And there's a couple of very high-level characters here, the ones that run the trade post. You don't want to have the players fighting them. You'll get killed instantly. So, but there is plot points where those agents of the Temple of Elemental Evil, both in the inn and at the trade shop, want to know what the players are up to and might want to infuse a henchman in their party to either rob them or follow them and see where they go, etc. So that's a neat way for you as a dungeon master to try to figure out how, like, okay, I got these bad guys in a town that no one knows about. If the players discover them as bad guys, they're too powerful and it'd be a nasty fight and everyone would get killed. Instead, you may want to think about them trying to have their henchmen come along and offer free services or free gear or stuff that may be useful for the players. So they'd be tempted to take this henchman along and then realize he does something suspicious later and they might want to confront the henchman, etc. So that's more of a dramatic point. So if your players enjoy that, besides just hack and slash and killing things and having fun getting loot, they may like the intrigue involved, which is one of the reasons why so much of this detail was put into this module, is because there is a lot of intrigue behind the scenes and there is a rising tension that the Temple of Elemental Evil is going to come to power again. It's just right down the road, 6 leagues away. So there's two characters in the inn called Kobold and Taruko or whatever, the ridiculous names. They're nasty as well. Be careful. Be sure that you read up on them and understand what their goals are and what they want to do. It's kind of scary if you think about it, but it keeps the adventure from feeling like a bunch of village idiots and bumpkins live here. So there's some powerful characters that are in the town, and the powerful characters would not be threatened by a party of level 3 or 4 adventurers that just arrived here who don't have much of their name. And of course, you heard me mention earlier the Viscount of Verbombog. There's a few financial endeavors, and the castle that's being worked on is all being done by that, so you could tie that together as well. So as you're reading through the module and you're getting your notes together and you're thinking, okay, if the players go here, what I got to remember? If they try to break into someone's house late at night, this is where where they're hiding their money and lock boxes. There's a lot of people that have jewelry and magic items concealed and hidden away in their home, so no one ever find them, because there is a money changer, but there's not really a bank. So unlike you might see in Ultima Online, no one has a secure place to store all their valuables. So as you've gathered probably so far, the major locations are going to be, the inn, the Church of St. Cuthbert, the inn's right here in the middle, the Druid of the Grove, which is basically across the street, the tower, and then this castle being built, and everything else is just kind of agricultural farmers and herdsmen and leather workers and things like that. You can get goods and services here, but most of the fun factor is going to come from the characters interacting with these major points. Now, take a breath here. The problem you may find is that some players may feel that they need to go knock on every door in the village. And that might be, you might want to shortchange that a little bit by having no one answer the door sometimes. Someone's off doing something, or have them be standoffish to strangers. They're not going to be, oh, hi, how are you? You want to keep it kind of simple. Most of the hubbub and the action is going to happen in the inn. There are travelers passing through. The guy that runs the inn has some secret passages and former secret meeting rooms from a long time ago. So you have a lot of fun things to do to spur the players onto like a call to action to do something from that anchor point. Like they can check in the inn, get a room, and then go wander around, explore everything, and then decide to go do something. Now, you're not really going to have a mission being delivered to the players in the inn unless you really want to do like the Strider Lord of the Rings type thing. You're more likely to have a mission coming from the Church of St. Cuthbert, something about the Moat House, and maybe the Druid. Those would be the two that I would think would be most interested in trying to find out what's going on. And one thing a lot of people miss is when they're looking at this around the map is that this little dirty, grimy path here on the east side, number 33, that is the actual path that leads off some distance away to the Moat House ruins. But let's jump back first to one of the things that makes this module great is, these old, drafted orthographic and overhead plan architectural maps done a long time ago in the 70s. And this is before you got computers really working, right? They're fantastic. Now, the grid sizes are different. They're all 10-foot grid. But if you need an in any of your adventures, this one's just brilliant. I mean, it's fantastic post and beam construction. It's got a ground floor. It's got a second floor with a bunch of rooms. It's got a basement with a bunch of storage stuff. It's got secret passages. It's got a kitchen. It works really, really great. And these orthographic views that are done here really give you a sense of like what the layout is and the scale and where the furniture is, which is really nice. I never really ever did this ever again, which is really disappointing. I mean, can you imagine if someone had made all the maps like this for, say, the city-state of the Invincible Overlord? Now, the good thing is if you search high and low on the internet, you can find John Pentar's VTT maps that he did, which have the one, a 5-foot square grid on it. He changed the seating to be, long bench seating, bench tables like you might find in a pub. That doesn't really matter. You can change it to whatever you want it to be. So he did the first level, the second level, and of course he also did the basement level. So if you can grab those, you can always print those out in color and have them at the table or redraw it yourself. Another thing that's really useful, of course, is the church that you heard me mention a few minutes ago. And it's got a great map as well with the orthographics. And of course, John Pentar has done maps for that as well, with this being the upper level, this being the lower level where the St. Cuthbert statue is, and then a basement level with some areas down below. So you start to see pretty quickly that the strength of the module is all the areas that are the major fixtures where the player characters will go. You got little maps for all of them. So that makes it much easier for you to not have to make anything up. When they don't make a map for every single little house. So you see like the leatherworker's house or the smith, there's no little maps for those. You can just make up some basic, front room type of one-story structure where the shop is or whatever, and the back room and back bedrooms, or maybe up in an attic is where the actual people that work and live in the same building. So you have to make those up. The Pathfinder 2nd edition has tons of great little maps for typical little houses like that, or you can just wing it and make up your own. John also did maps for the tower, which is really, really well done. Now, we're going to wrap things up here pretty soon, but I need to warn you about this Moat House. If you heard me say this earlier, the Moat House is tuned for really experienced large party. It's a great little adventure. The background on it is fantastic. The description here of how you get there through all the thorns and the thistles and the weeds, it comes right out of Cinderella or Snow White or something. It's miles away from the actual town. No one really goes there anymore. Even the path continues on to the Temple of Elemental Evil. I mean, even it takes an hour on horseback to get there. That's pretty big distance. Probably at least, maybe 4 or 5 miles. Once they actually get to this location and start exploring it, one of the things that's really tricky is this first level where the obvious way in is across the old shattered, broken drawbridge with the old grimy moat around it. And one of the first encounters is like a bunch of giant frogs that'll kill all the characters if they're not very well equipped. I mean, I can't tell you how many times this Area 1 can just ruin and take the wind out of everyone's sails. So once again, be sure your player characters are leveled up and got some good armor class going down, or reduce the number of these guys. And let's just go down here. Let's jump down to that part of the adventure so you can see what I'm talking about. We go past the church here, and when you get past down to the Moat House, you'll see 6 giant frogs, hit points 13, 10, 7, 6, 4, 4, AC 7. Most of the encounters in the Moat House and the Moat House dungeon are easy to hit AC, but the enemies have a lot of hit points and they hit hard. So, you've got like a level 2 fighter with 14 hit points, and they're fighting 6 giant frogs, and the first 3 frogs have the same number of hit points as them, but they have a weaker armor class like that of a thief or an assassin or maybe a monk. So that's the disadvantage if you're playing the game and the party isn't very tactile, tactically minded, and they rush in there, and the fighters in the front, and then a ranger starts shooting a bow, and a magic loose off the side, and a frog jumps them. There's going to be a death. Now, this is one thing in 5th edition players don't do as much, but us old school guys do, is that if someone gets killed, right, you do have this high level cleric at the Church of St. Cuthbert. If you can recover the body, throw him over a horse and drag him back to that church, and he can, raise dead or resurrect them for a fee, or for them doing some kind of a quest for them. But it's going to be more fun if your player characters go in here and clear a number of areas first, and then work their way to the stairs that lead down. They don't need to explore everything. It's not really necessary. But if you've ever been to a historical castle where everything's all dusty and grimy and there's cobwebs everywhere, I mean, there's many forts from the Civil War in the United States that are like this. It's a great opportunity for you to, have really fun, interesting encounters of things that have moved in after this castle was taken over. So that part's gonna be really fun for you. And John Pintar did a great map for it. But once again, he's got the thing at one square equals 5 feet. Now, here's what's really nasty. When the players are coming downstairs and they enter this lower level, there are some pretty hard encounters, especially over here in area 11, 12, 17, 18, and 16. That's, considered kind of like the climax of the boss. And even in this first area here, there's some pretty nasty stuff that goes down. Most people never find the secret door at 5. Be sure you have read through that part and think about, okay, I run this for my teenage son and 2 of his friends and his younger sister, and mom's going to play too. You may find that, the ogre is cool, and having the ogre in there and the crayfish in the pool is fine too. But the bugbears may just be too much. 9 gnolls, maybe it's just 4. Think about changing that stuff around so your players can feel challenged and can win, like it's on the edge of getting them killed, but not to such a degree they're so crippled that when they go to the next area they can't do anything. Because in Dungeons & Dragons, when the party's all wounded and damaged, it's not like they can just rest for 10 minutes to get their health back. Technically, they'd have to go, bandage their wounds and go rest for like 8 hours, and clerics have to get their spells back. It takes a long time to recover from a nasty fight. So don't be afraid to house rule that. Like in my house rules that are on my website that are free to help things move along, depending upon your audience. If you got a bunch of old grognard old school guys, then just do it the old school way. They'll go back to the town and rest and do all this kind of business. Remember that when someone goes into a dungeon and they conquer 3 or 4 rooms and they leave for 12 to 16 hours and come back, somebody else might moved right back in. And that's a good time for the bugbears that you see in the random encounter table, or obviously rats and stuff like that, to jump back in there and repopulate and try to fix things that were ruined by a combat encounter that happened here. All right, so, this very last thing when you talk about is this Lareth the Beautiful character, which is actually a guy, but there's mentions to this, vain level 5 cleric with this, group of bandits with him that's kind of running the show down here, right? And there's mention to the demon Sloth, but that's never a story thread ever connected. And let's zoom in here a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. This is like the hardest enemy in the entire thing. He's got a staff of striking with 20 charges. He's been sent to the area to rebuild a force of men and human fighters to gather loot and restore the Temple of Elemental Evil to its former glory. Of course, Lareth is one of so many charged, but he's looked upon with special favor and expectation, but they don't say by who, right? So this is a great chance for you to plant a map or a series of dispatches or messages or something that's going to help the players figure out how to get into that first area in the Temple of Elemental Evil if they do graduate up and earn enough levels to go forward with that. Utilize this character here as a connecting dot, kind of the way they connected the Drow and the Steading and Hill Giant Chief to the Glacial Rift or Frost Giant Jarl to the, Hall of the Fire Giant King. Those 3 adventures are probably the 3 best for connecting plot points from one to the next. So when the players finally get to the last area, they see that there's a connection to a greater power, a greater force, and they're lured into going to go do that, because that's where the fun factor happens, because the players are creating their own goals for themselves. They're guiding the adventure their way, and you're not having to railroad anything. And it feels more like they're just kind of, hey, let's go figure this out. And so sometimes dropping those kind of seeds in there are great. Of course, with any type of dungeon crawl encounter like this, the players, there's so much valuables here, right? Like all these opals and some of this phylactery action, and they're going to probably want to go back and spend all this and try to upgrade everything. And that's where you're going to want to think about, well, do you allow players to buy magic items in your campaign, or do you allow them to be crafted, or do you want to sprinkle in particular weapons in this dungeon to help them? I like that method better. Like, for example, when you fight this final guy here, and if your party has like a dwarven warrior and a cleric, hey, it's a great time to throw a couple pairs of plate mail and a shield in there, a flail and a warhammer, and maybe a longsword. You got a couple elves in there, throw in a longbow and another longsword. Like, throw the magic items on the encounter, kind of like World of Warcraft, unfortunately, that are more useful to the players so they can continue moving forward, as opposed to what most of the Gygax/TSR modules do, which is things like this, 3 to 12 gold pieces and 29 100 gold piece gems, a chain worth 500 and a topaz worth 1,000. I mean, those are things that players are going to need to go take and trade in for money, and they're going to end up having these 48,000 gold pieces with nothing to do with them. And they're going to be if they play 5th edition or they play Pathfinder, they're going to want to pressure you, the DM, for them to like go to Valuna or go to Verbalbach or go back to the Village of Hommlet and try to buy a bunch of magic items. Like even in Baldur's Gate that happened, right? Just buying magic items off the vendor. So it's always better to seed the adventure with the type of loot that the players will go, oh wow, this is awesome, I got this cool scimitar. And you can change that on the fly. Like if one weekend someone's playing and someone drops off and you have a new person playing who's playing a druid, put druid stuff in there, right? Maybe tone down the amount of fat loot money that's in there. And I think if you do these types of techniques, your players will have more fun because they'll be gaining power by getting that armor class lower. Their rolls to hit will be higher. You put the elements that tie the adventure together, and when they're done with all this, they're probably going to be at least level 5. And at that point, they're probably ready to maybe move on to the Temple of Elemental Evil. You could have a situation where the St. Cuthbert Church that we talked about earlier, when they come back in town, they're approached by the cleric at St. Cuthbert, because there is a story beat about that, right? Let's go back up here real quick. If you go to the, let's go back up to the actual church right up itself. When you go to the church, there's conversation and notes about one of the clerics being away, right? And this could be a situation where they're away, Yade is in the Temple of Elemental Evil, and Turjan's keeping the church in order, and gets word that something's happened, and they want you to go find out and send something, and maybe he even comes along as an NPC. So that's what a really interesting point where the Church of St. Cuthbert, along with your players, now go on a mission to go to the next connecting adventure of the whole thing. But yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to go over to give you that insight into. I've run this like 10 to 15 times when I was a teenager. I ran a few times in my 20s and early 30s. I haven't run in a long time, but it has a lot of fun, interesting connected dots in here that are hard for the shorter attention span players to realize that there's something there to go do and discover or solve as a mystery. So you're going to need to kind of like connect those dots better for them. Unless you have a bunch of murder hobos, then it's going to be a nightmare, because there are high level guys in here that would end that quite quick. But it's the classic. If you ever need a church, it's got a great church. If you ever need an inn, it's got a great inn. It's got a great tower. The moat house thing can be put anywhere in your adventure world and whatever you got in your campaign. But for a starting adventure, this one's probably one of the biggest classics of all time. Okay, cool. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you had fun with this video. Leave feedback below, and we'll see you at the next one. Take care.